So we're starting on the fourth tape now, May 2019, and we're going to talk about the Broders game. I remember I was out selling savings plans at the time when they were playing the final game in, I think it was Ottawa, it was down east, and they won the Canadian Championship. I was sitting in my car listening to it on the radio. And a lot of the old fellows that I went to school with or knew of, the Jack Lilia, newspaper clippings of the day showing all the people here, some of which were schoolmates of me. Don Dorham here was from the Lethbridge Herald. Glenn Ennis was around the school days with me. And we'll move on. Inspired team defies the odds to capture the crown. It was quite a day. Basketball, Southern Alberta champs. Now back in the 50s and the 40s, some of the main music people, big band era came to Lethbridge. I was quite young for some of them, but I remember having I was a great fan of Spike Jones, had his records, and he came to Lethbridge, obviously, in the early days of, says May 1946, he came to Lethbridge.
Cocktails for Two would be an ideal example. For the first 30 seconds of that record, you think you're listening to Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians.
Oh, what do I do to give him the right to be happy and gay once again? We're thinking, respectfully thinking, like civilized ladies and men. No longer need our charming scene.
Here we go.
Overlooks the avenue. Someone sharing a delight. Some laughs and cocktails for two. As we enjoy a cigarette.
Great fun.
Stomachs with a chance.
And moving on, Tommy Dorsey was another fellow that made a trip to Lethbridge in 1951. We don't have any sound for him. Here's a collage that I made up from his record albums. Being a trombone player, I was really into Dorsey from the very early years. 2,000 attended. A few years ago I made a series on based on Dad's movies of Waterton Lakes, and they have been very popular over the years. Let's see if we can play a little bit of it. Was one of many Dad's friends. We'll go back to first. Waterton Lake in 1938. Soon you'll see what looks like a classic Chris Craft wooden speedboat of the 1930s. They were real gems. These are, of course, on YouTube, my YouTube channel, Lake Linnet. This is Lake Linnet, no longer used for swimming. Waterton Lake was far too cold in those days. It was my first nature class as we watched Thousands of tadpoles. Sometimes we call them sperms. Gradually, as summer progressed, the little tadpoles would turn into little wee frogs. It was quite an exciting time. How I loved it when we would rent the little cart, pulled by a Shetland pony, and wander around the town site. I'm Bruce, wearing the hat. John Patterson is driving. There's also Sister Betty Ellen and Ed Rice. Moving on. This is a shirt that I found. I don't think, well, maybe I did put this up. I guess I did. Never underestimate an old man who was born in October. Obviously, I don't know. Guess I put it up. I wonder what this. What you do is part of the D-Day story. June 6th. This is put together for June 6th event, invasion bulletins. And I believe I had talked about Juneau and so on. This was my contribution to the D-Day invasion. This is probably part of the same one, I'm not sure. This photo may show violent graphic content that was put in there for let people know that they may not like what they see. I remember that I had a picture of what it looks like today, and then the other picture was what it looked like in the wartime. Not a pretty picture. Moving on. This is from a series that took Jim Cousins out to visit the land of Peter Fiddler. This is from a news release in the 1990s.
Much of southern Alberta history lies in the Porcupine Hills. It was here where legendary explorers David Thompson and Thomas Blackiston first charted the area with nothing more than a pair of moccasins and a sextant. Historians are now trying to add another name to the list of legendary explorers, a man who walked through this region 2 centuries ago.
In the shadow of the Rocky Mountains today, historians Bruce Haig and Dr. James Cousins have retraced the steps of a forgotten explorer.
It was kind of a cool day for my old friend Jim Cousins and I to meet, and as I took him out to visit the land of Peter Fiddler.
I'd like to see Peter Fiddler recognized as the prime explorer of this part of the world, which includes Lethbridge and McLeod and the Crow's Nest Pass and everything in southwestern Alberta.
This was special for Mother's Day. This gem from 5 years ago just propped up in the news feed. Happy birthday. Happy almost Father's Day, Bruce, and thanks for ongoing entertainment, angst, roast, and toasted column. Well, Lori, I guess, must have put that on my site with my famous Jones birthday shirt. "1950s, lots of boys joined the Cadet Corps." So I did a little sequence on the cadets. It was I remember hearing from Van Luken, and a few days later he was dead. He had died down in Arizona, I believe. This was a little segment I did pointing out. I remembered as a child when they moved this home here, which is where Bodards lived at 1220 8th Avenue South, on the corner of 8th Avenue and 12th Street A. And I had always heard that it was from the site of the Mormon Church. I don't know who told me that or where I picked it up, but it was just always in my mind that that's what had happened. So analyzing these old photographs, I decided that this must be the house that they're referring to. So this little segment was showing the picture, original picture showing the house and the house as I see it today. And the site was where the Mormon Church was built after the war. Where the Mormon Church was built after the war. This church burned down in the 60s, I believe, but that's another story. The band, this was a picture taken of the band back in the 40s. Here I am here playing my old horn from the prisoner of war camp, Terry Defoe beside me. This is before I got my trombone, or a series of pictures that I got from Hamilton showing one of the graduating classes from Hamilton Junior High. And I believe this is the same year that Janice Haig graduated, because she is in the next picture, maybe not. She's in one of the pictures, but I think this is a couple of years after me, so it brought it maybe about 1953. It's in the Marquis Hotel, grade 9 Hamilton Junior High. One Sadie Hawkins day, after I returned from Trinity and was involved, well, I'm not sure when this was. One of the Sadie Hawkins days, I took my movie camera and dressed up and got in the spirit of things. And this is a movie that I made at the time. This is from Little Abner.
Yeah, I know.
There's Morris Cohen,
Well, I don't know. I just did that.
Bruce there,
Why?
Herb Schechter,
Well, there you...
and here we are. This is Bob Clifford, who was one of my first playmates, lived just across the street when I was a kid. This is Mo somebody other, and this is me. That same day somebody lifted my skirt playing around, and I dropped the camera and light got in it for the rest of its life. I still have the camera here, by the way, in the display case. Little Abner.
Come on, wait.
Then I did one on the sternwheelers. I did two versions. This is Old Man River with the song, but I haven't put that one up yet. I'm saving that. And I went back to using the second version, which is this one here, which has things from the broadcasting at the time, I do believe. Let's see if we can get some sound from it. Whoops. This is the Old Man River one that has gone up. I guess they're both Old Man River. This is the Old Man River version, which I was going to use, but didn't as yet. Instead, I used one from the recording of the radio stations, which hopefully will show up soon. But just in case, I'll play this one and see what happens. No, it's the same thing. Moving on. This is a segment I did trying to find out what these buildings were from the experts that might be online. And it was mentioned, let's see if we got it here. I thought Belinda Crowson, yes, she said that this one is probably the Sashendorf factory. That would make sense. And she said that number one looks like where Oliver Manufacturing had their lumber yard sheds. Okay, could be. Never heard of that before. That's one of the advantages of this group. You learn all kinds of things. This is a segment that I shared with clippings from Lethbridge House, which was a big house on one of the main streets, and it was shipped out, and I believe it's down near Lundbreck. You can imagine going down the highway with that fellow. Before the United States got into World War II, there was an effort to help the Allied cause. American pilots were not allowed to fly aircraft into Canada because of the neutrality laws, so they were flown to Sweetgrass and pulled across the border to be flown by Canadian pilots to Lethbridge and beyond. And this is a movie that I found showing them pulling that across. And newspaper articles describing the event. This is the type of planes that they were obviously bringing across. Eugene Cost, because of him we have natural gas. Because of him, we had natural gas long before most of the rest of Canada. And I believe it was from down in the area around Bow Island. And this is his home in Calgary, which I visited. At least I visited the outside of it many years ago. And a school named after him. These are all different stories that I've shared for my various groups. This is the tragic story I found in the newspaper of a fire that occurred just out behind where St. Michael's Hospital was, I believe. It was 1940, so I don't remember it, but it was a tragic story in this area. Let's see this one. Galt Sternwheeler Centennial, 1983. We'll put the sound up.
The valiant mariners and their exotic craft will hit the non-briny ripples of the Old Man River tomorrow morning to recreate the 100th anniversary of the historic river shipment of coal between Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. The organizer of the epic journey, Bruce Haig of Lethbridge, says all is in readiness.
There's one boat, I believe, has fallen out again, so I think we're down to, what would it be, 9 boats, I guess, now. But the others are all go. As far as I know, they're all ready.
Haig also suggests, come what may, the weather will not be a deterrent and could add to the heroic cruise.
Well, there's no such thing as a miserable weekend. It'll be good. If it rains, that means you get a little bit more water. So nothing bad about the weather, no matter what.
Lunchtime will be at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The site of the cast-off will be just downstream of the 6th Avenue Bridge in Indian Battle Park, across the river from the historical Old Sharon coal mine.
This event became much bigger than I ever expected it to be. So I would say it was quite the success. They continued on another year, and I spent my time organizing, trying to get a group together to go all the way to Batoche, which a group of us went, and that's another story.
Thanks very much, Ken. Good afternoon, everyone.
A free-range kids of the 1940s, I often explored the downtown area and have long collected pictures showing how it has evolved over the years. Lately, I started looking for computer programs that would allow me to put the pictures in sequence and easily make changes as new information emerges. Ah, there we are. I think this must
First part of it is 3rd Avenue, south side, between 5th and 6th Streets. And I started on 6th Street because it seems more natural as I was looking at it. So I've got arrows pointing from today's picture over here and what the building looked back at the turn of the last century. Here's an arrow going to this one. Here's a today's picture and pointing to the equivalent picture back in the last century. Moving along, we have pictures from the 5th Street now. These two are quite similar to, this one looks a little earlier than this one, but you can analyze the different changes of each picture. Here you can see that Coaldale is on the top of the hotel. Here it isn't. Streetcars are there in both pictures. This one here, I'll be able to put arrows in.
I'm assuming that this one is also online somewhere.
Possibly the earliest. Then you go here. Then you get the garden.
This next one was the based on King George and Queen Elizabeth's visit to Calgary in 1939 when they made their trip across Canada to get support for the Empire because they knew that war was coming. I would say this was the main reason for the big trip. And this was our family visited to Calgary to see the parade. I discovered this Harold Lloyd fellow simply on the internet, and it was an example of somebody who was quite famous in Lethbridge in the 30s and would have been showing at the local theaters, and that's why I made a production number of him for the groups that I belong to. The nostalgia groups, historical groups, 3 of them that I belong to locally. Let's see what he sounds like. I guess this would be the 1920s, before they had the direct sound. The year was 1943 and Canada was at war. Lethbridge students were to be suspended. This is an article talking about how I think they wouldn't salute the flag, and they were suspended from school. Of course, it was the height of the war, so things were different in those days. This is Pyramid Motors, a photograph that I have in my collection, 1946, and then of course it was sold by Frank Calder and Bryant, and it became Horn Motors and burned down in 1963. So this is the story of that event. This is a story of my smoking days. My first cigarette that I smoked was in the bushes along the Laundry Hill going to the river bottom. Myself and a few friends were lying in the bushes there having our first cigarettes. And then I went on to talk about the fact that how I managed to quit smoking by putting pictures of the fronts of packages on my wall at university, and realizing how much it cost, it was time to quit. This is the story of my automobile days and why I bought a Volvo. And I described the fact that in the early 60s, they had what they called races across Canada on back roads. Shell 4000 was one of them, and they raced these cars through all the rugged north.
94 men and women from 5 countries set out on one of the great adventures of motorsport, the Shell 4000 Rally.
And I believe the Volvo was one of the winners, and they sold me on.
For 6 days, they'll live in their cars, pausing only for precious hours of sleep at Calgary, Regina, Winnipeg, Sault Ste. Marie, and Toronto. Destination, Montreal. The challenge, getting there on time. As each day's run begins, crews receive instructions showing the route to follow and the average speeds they must maintain. These speeds are well below the posted limits, but there's no margin for errors. Barely out of Vancouver in the excitement of the start, crews are confronted with the first of many time controls to come during the next 6 days. Navigators run to get their time cards stamped. Many controls are not shown on the instructions. Crews must reach 60 of them between Vancouver and Montreal at exactly the right minute.
This seems to be something that was quite popular in Europe, because I remember some of the immigrants that I met in the late 50s did this type of rallying. This is interesting from Gary Greenway. Just a little letter asking for information. The Greenways lived up the street, and the Piscos lived up the street as well. What does it say? My cousin Gary Greenway is wondering, who knew that was his cousin, is wondering if you have a class photo of Central School, grade 6. Well, I'm sorry, since I never went to that school, I didn't ever come across that. In 1947, the 1923 Immigration Act repealed, and it became possible for Chinese to immigrate to obtain Canadian citizenship. And I can remember in the late 40s and early 50s, I guess it would be, there was school basketball citywide, and one of the teams that was always winning was this group of Chinese students who were obviously much older than the junior high school kids, and but they were taking, I guess, English as a second language, and knew how to play baseball. They knew how to play basketball. This next segment, did you ever know anyone who at one time owned a Volkswagen Beetle and wondered why? And here I was talking about the joys of having a Volkswagen, which was very, very popular in the late 50s and 60s. This was my 1958, and we went down to the States and just decided to sleep. We just went off the road and made the Betsy, as we called her, took the seats out, had a floorboard that we put down, and that was our bed, and cooked like such. And my Volkswagen ended up getting an award if you went 60,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers without a major repair. They would give you a watch, and I got one, which I sold many, many years later for around $300. So, and it was used, well used. This is a little service book you got when you bought a Volkswagen. They had a whole system, a much better system on looking after your cars. They gave you instructions to do at what particular mileage and so on. It was well organized, the German method, I guess. And that was used more and more with American cars as time went on. This is where I did an article on Car City, which in 1958 was big in Lethbridge. They were selling little Volkswagen Beetles like crazy, and the Mo Hellman went a little overboard. I remember he had the Bay Service station. He had sold Volkswagens, but he drove a Cadillac, and he invested in all kinds of things, and some of them went belly up. For example, Car City, he had a restaurant, and he had a hairstylist in there, the idea that you would get your hair done while you had your car serviced and all this kind of thing. And it didn't really work out that well. And he just left town, as far as I know. This is when money ran out. There's the $1 million establishment. Oh, only $250,000. Sorry. Which should be well over $1 million nowadays. So these are the collection of hood ornaments that I had in my photo collection, and I put it up on the groups because there's a lot of car lovers in the nostalgia section of those groups, and I'd collected these over the years at various car shows that I went to. This little item I did based on the 1940s and 50s of bicycles. And during the war, of course, bicycles were short. And I remember when you did manage to find one, they didn't have chrome on them. The handlebars were actually just black. Then, in about 1947 or so, balloon tires after the war became quite popular, and I had a Schwinn which I babied and loved. That was the bicycle carrier I had when I was working for the drug delivery. And this is...
In the 1940s, pedaling the bicycle underbar was the way you went places. Bikes were hard to come by in war years, and one size fit all.
So this is how I learned.
In the 1940s, pedaling the bicycle underbar was the way you went places. Bikes were hard to come by in war years, and one size fit all.
So that's how I learned how to ride a bicycle. We only had one size, and although the kids down the street had kids' bicycles, I didn't have one, and I learned by simply underbar. At Waterton Lakes is when I learned the technique. This is the Schwinn this is what the Schwinn model was that I had, 1946 Schwinn. It was picked up in Great Falls, and I used it until when I was delivering groceries, or not groceries, when I was delivering drugs in the early 50s. At noontime I had to go across town, and I got a 3-speed bicycle, which was it was a Humber, but it was basically put out by Raleigh, same bicycle, different name, and thinner tires, 3 speeds, much easier to push around. And I remember the Schwinn, when I went off to Trinity in 1952, it was upside down in the fruit cupboard. I don't know whether had been trying to repair it or what, but by the time I got back, my dad had got rid of it, given it to somebody up the street, I believe. My precious Schwinn. One of the things I liked about the Schwinn, here's the Schwinn, this is mine. This crazy little light at the back didn't last very long, I don't think. Had a horn in it. And I loved the fact that, whoops, let's go back here. I thought maybe there was a picture of the tires had the same tread on them as the car tires, the Goodyear tread, which I thought was kind of cool. In those days you had to get a license, a metal license for your bicycle, probably $5 or so. And this is the 3-speed hub, the 3-speed gear shift that was unique and just started to come into vogue at the time that I really needed it, when I was on the delivery of drug routine. I worked for Kitson's for the summer, and later on I was with Draffens. The Hell Drivers. This is a big summer show that went around in the 30s and 40s, and this little talks about one of the fellows, Earl Lucky Tedder. Though he wasn't so lucky, he was killed during a jump in 1943. Fortunately, that wasn't in Lethbridge. But they used to come here. This is the ads for one of the years. And we're moving on. This was a little segment that I did on architecture, and I was always enthralled with the old Coca-Cola building, which had been the man named Mr. Price. I went to school with Lorraine Price. They lived down the street, just a few houses down the block, and this is the building that they built, obviously in the late 30s, early 40s. And this is different designs that occurred for the same building over time. Music Place, and then it was Drapery Place, and then it was Stovepipe, like stoves, and back to the original. When I was on the board of the Historical Resources Foundation, made trips out to Fort Macleod, and one time I took the walking tour of Fort Macleod, which was quite a big thing at the time. And this is a brochure that I had from those days, which I talked about on my news groups. This is Jock Palmer, who I was always intrigued by because he was a very early aviator, and he was the man that started the radio station Sea Jock. And I did some research on him and presented it as part of the news group. As I said many times, I try to put in at least one event every day. And lately I've been putting up 2 because I do the timeline as well. Let's see, I think there's a sound line here on this one. I don't hear it very loud.
Anticipating that will become a major hurricane, category 3 or better.
Jock Palmer was selling these as well as developing the industry. Gradually over the year, the name changed. The CJOC started in 1926, and this would have been one of the models that he was selling at the time. And I believe his store where he was working out of was where the arrow says, and this is directly across from the Sherlock block. This was directly across from the McFarland building, the entrance to the McFarland building. Here you can see Eaton's over here in the post office down the street. And the picture would have been around 1920s, late 1920s, I would say. .514 4th Avenue. So that would be about the right spot. There he is in his Air Force uniform from the First World War, I expect. I think I may have talked about this earlier. Maybe not. Anyway, this is from the Junior Symphony days. And here I am here as an assistant conductor. And Radnowski over here. And I'm sure that part of this was done earlier, at least I have found. He died in 1998 down in California. He really put Lethbridge on the map for classical music. He had all those kids on the north side dragging home violins, and he was a real go-getter, but he was too far ahead of the rest of the community, and he went off and did other things. And I ended up having to pretend I knew how to teach all these instruments, but it was better than being cooped up in the classroom, the regular classroom. It was something different, something unique. This is a segment of some of the music that you'd heard in those early days. Let's see if we can get some sound here. It's put out by the CBC. Prairie Schooner. And another one.
Madam, will you please put away that knitting? You're going to have to applaud, you know. Now let's all relax. Everybody, shall we? Nobody be nervous.
Everybody listen to this in the morning.
All set?
Yeah, every morning. If you were home from school, you had to listen to the Happy Gang. This was a little segment I simply got a kick out of. It was a picture on the web, I expect, of the Civic Center. And it was labeled Lethbridge Waste and Recycling Department, which is really the City Hall. I guess I got a chuckle out of that. And this is when my computer broke, and I tried to find out if there was somebody that had an old computer that they wanted to sell. And fortunately, I was able to get mine working again and got a new one, and I didn't need to beg, borrow, or steal. Although I might have done a little begging. This is another one of Do You Remember segments that I had talked about on earlier events. The Marquis Hotel was big in Lethbridge, and this is a segment I did on the history of the Marquis Hotel, explaining how it was basically local shareholders that invested in it. Every city, if you were a city of any importance, you had to have a major hotel. And Lethbridge, since there was no railway company or anything that wanted to put one here, the city got together and sold shares, and so the local business people put together the Marquis Hotel. This was a series of articles that I did on Lethbridge buildings, Lethbridge homes, for the real estate company back in the 80s. This was one I did on Higginbotham's house. And this is another one on Higginbotham where I described basically all the different houses that he had lived in, a little bit more background. This is the one that burned down in later years. Here's the old whoop-up cannon that was in his yard. There's the same building when it burned down in the, again, I think it was in the 80s. Yeah, 84. This is the home that is now on the site, just up the street. It was a boarding house at the time that it burned down, and this particular listing is from a book I compiled a few years ago about all the different homes that were on the way down the street on 12th Street. This was my street, and I made a record of all the different people that had lived in each home over the years. And this is more information on the book, which was called Walk a Block and Wonder, and it's now on my website at the university. This was on a section on Higginbotham's store that I did. This is at the height of its glory, center of town, and this is at its low point a few years ago. Since that time, it has been torn up a bit and somewhat restored, and various businesses have been in there over the years now. And this is a section I did on the interior of the store. Now, I am suspicious that this man here is Mr. Tufts that lived next door. I have no proof, but since he's dressed up not as a pharmacist, and he was a little man, and he worked with Higginbotham over the years, and I expect that he's the bookkeeper, which is what he was, and I think I'm correct. This is the interior. Here's J.D. Higginbotham himself. And here you have different ointments and stuff, labels from different things that he sold. The story is that his brother or one of his relatives had a store in New York or down east somewhere, and they would simply exchange labels for the same product. This is when I was trying to unload various copies of the book over the years. All gone now. And the Lethbridge Post Office, they were looking for a name for it, the official name for it, the Government of Canada. And there was a contest, and Alec Johnson put a name in, and I put in Higginbotham, and a group of school students from one of the schools took it up and wrote in, and all the kids wrote a letter supporting Higginbotham, and that made it so that I won the contest. Moving up. This is a series of checks that I did, showing in those days, until 1953, you had to put a stamp on each check. You had to pay money to make the check, and they did it by putting a stamp on it. It says up here, do you remember when you wrote a check, you had to put a stamp on it? Canada's excise tax for checks started in 1915 during the war and ended in 1953. It was a way to pay for the war effort, and they forgot to take it off after the war. This is an article mentioning that I'm trying to sell my equipment that I made the books from, but had no takers. Well, that's not true. I put it on Kijiji, and there's a man up way far north that is trying to beat me down so that I could really just give it to him. So it's still in the storeroom. And these are more information about J.D. Higginbotham. In this case, it's a picture of his home and his earlier home back in 1905, which was on 3rd Avenue, where the paint store is, the corner of 3rd Avenue and 13th Street. Chinook Club is in front of it, and his house was just sort of behind it. Interior of the home, and this is 13th Street where the lumber yard was. Oh, going the wrong way. And this is some of the quotes from J.D. Higginbotham's book When the West Was Young, which I published back in the 70s. Tenderfeet, who left their shoes outside the room doors to be shined, had them thrown back through the transoms as likely as not, and the shoes hit their owners in the head if the latter were not good dodgers. These are sketches that the kids made based on information in the book. Cute little quotes, and these are the kids' interpretation of the quotes. When he came to town, he headed to the Lethbridge Hotel, which was kept by two Scotsmen, Hogg and Henderson. While larger and more considerable improvement over the old hostelry in Fort Macleod, or Macleod as it was called, it was nevertheless a pretty crude affair. The rooms, according to the custom of the days, were divided by cotton partitions. These were but 7 feet high, upstairs, so that one standing on a chair could see from one end of the building to the other. This is when I started to put in the daily timeline of things that happened on this day in history. And so that's what all these are about. And I'm not going to go over them. I put them in every day. These are ones I made up in advance, ready to simply put them online when that date arrived. And this appears to be August, say 10th, or 11th, or around about when I did the birthday present. The birthday for Joan with my famous shirt that I've had every year, which I've got to find for this year and put the age on it. Again, we'll ignore these. This is a trip that I made with my buddies Ralph Redding and Barry Clark when we went to the States for a long weekend, and pretended that we were the Yukon Territory Jazz Trio. Barry had watercolored the sides of the car, and until it rained that night, at which point we had to change our story and became a traveling entomological company, which wasn't nearly as much fun. We went to dances and played the cool guys and did teenager stuff, you know. This picture, this is from when I took the kids, my school kids, down the Missouri River. And this is a slideshow that I made on the event. Hopefully we're going to see it, but maybe not. We'll see what happens. Yep, there it is. There must have been some sound. We'll see if there's sound. Guess there is, but I don't hear it. It's kind of a neat effect. It's a great trip. It's the only part of the Missouri-Mississippi system that hasn't been changed over the years. So all these landmarks are as they were, more or less, in the very early days of Lewis and Clark. And I expect that this is on the YouTube site. If not, I'll try and get it there. I don't know what happened here. This is Jerry Potts, a little bit of information I did on Jerry Potts, comparing the picture of him with... okay, let's go back and see if we can get him down. This is Jerry Potts' photograph, and here's a bubblegum card that was made during the early 70s of Jerry Potts. This number is one I put on for a film production. And then also, this is a Jerry Potts statue. This is in wax, but it's the wax version of one that Cordy Martins was making for the Mounted Police Centennial when I took the kids out to his workshop in Coaldale. And this is a version of Jerry Potts in one of the advertisements for the Mounted Police Centennial. So this person copies this person who copies this person who copies that person, and on it goes.